good afternoon. It is a joy to be with you today. A couple things before we even begin how today is going to work. I'm going to speak for 5 or 6 hours, and then you're going to I'll give a message, kind of a 40-minute time period, and then you'll get a chance to take a break and stretch. We'll come back here, we'll have the rest of the message, and then you'll get time to have a conversation, which is really the important part of the night. So don't skip that, because your voice, this room is set up the way all churches are and all auditoriums are. A bunch of people facing one direction and facing one person, making you think that the person who you're facing is more important. And that's not true. The truth is that your story is as important to tonight as the story that I'm going to share with you. I'm overjoyed to be with you. I'm glad you're here for 2 reasons. One, because you are a once-in-history, never-to-be-repeated creation made in the image of God. I'm glad you're here because of that. I'm also glad you're here because you prove to me that you're not just bots on my social media profile, right? You actually exist. Because doing the work that I do, I write words, and then I put those words out to the world, and then I think people read them. And I have that data that tells me that people are reading them. So intellectually I understand that, right? But it's really difficult on a daily basis to connect that data to flesh and blood human beings. And so when I get to drive through a city I've never been to before, and you show up, and you're alive and real and beautiful, it gives joy to my heart. So thank you for making my day already. Today is exciting, right? Yes? Yes. And it's not exciting because I'm here. It's exciting because humanity has never been arranged in this specific configuration in the history of the planet, and it's never going to be arranged that way again, which means what we're doing in this room today, you may not realize it, but it's unprecedented, it's historic. And what we do in this building today, if we do it correctly, it's going to alter the world outside this building, which is what we want, right? I mean, we want to come together in community because community is medicinal. And we want to come together and have a genuine experience together that changes us. But if we just leave it here and do nothing to change the situation outside, then we've wasted our time. So I'm glad you're here. There's so much that we could talk about in the next day and a half that we have together. I'm expanding it because we've locked the doors now. Hope you realize that. All your babysitters, I just need to share some things with you. And as you're coming in, I wonder why you're here. I look at you and I think, what could make them leave the beautiful day out there to come to talk to a total stranger? Maybe you read one of the books, or maybe you're a fan of the blog, or maybe you're part of this local faith community, or maybe you're an older person, you're a fan of Saturday Night Live, and you thought you were here to see John Lovitz. Sorry to disappoint you. But it's not a rhetorical question when I ask you why you're here. Would a few of you just share, put up your hand and just say nice and loud, what brought you here today? Why are you here? Maybe you've been forced by a spouse.
I was invited to come.
You were invited to come.
Curiosity.
Okay.
I wanted to know if the person at the other end of the blog was real.
All right, so you want to know if the person at the other end of the blog was real. Well, that's debatable. We'll find out. Why are you here? Yes, Matt.
I do a sermon on one of your book titles in a few months.
You do a sermon on one of my book titles. Okay, I'm going to have my people sue your people.
We've been reading your book in Sunday school, and it's a real challenge for me about what you're on the author.
Great, you've been reading the book in Sunday school. It's giving you some challenges, so you wanted to kind of process some of that. Beautiful. Sir.
Looking for spiritual leadership.
Looking for spiritual leadership. Hopefully Brian McLaren will be here in 6 months. We'll have to wait for that. But, yes, thank you.
You're raising a 5-year-old daughter and trying to figure out how to orient her in the world.
Okay, 5-year-old daughter. How do you orient your child in the world now, especially as a person of faith? How do you do that? Beautiful. Well, there are as many stories as there are people in this room, and they're all valid, right? We all come here for a different reason. And I want to tell you a little bit about why I'm here as we begin. Not why I'm just in this room today, but why I do the work that I do. People ask me, what is your job title now? And I say, well, I'm a polarizing public figure talking about faith and politics. And I want you to know that was not the plan. So if you're here today and your plan is to be a polarizing public figure talking about faith and politics, you need prayer and a better plan, okay? So, a couple things. Why I do what I do is that I have been a pastor in the local church now for going on 25 years. During that time, I have seen beautiful things. I've had a front row seat to really life-changing moments, things that I was really proud to be a part of. But I've also, as a local pastor, seen things I grieved over. I have seen things in my local church, but in the church in America that has caused me to mourn. And it seems like more and more that is happening. And so I want people to hear a different voice of the Christian faith than the one that has the microphone right now. I'm here because I believe every person has the same inherent worth. And I believe there are so many people leading our churches and leading our governments who really don't believe that. And so I want to stand unapologetically with the lovers of all people. I'm here because I've been a Christian for most of my life. I would tell you that I'm still a Christian today, but I have more and more difficulty claiming that title because I know that that name now lies in the minds of so many people. I know all the baggage and all the pain and all the bigotry. And so I'm trying to be, as many of you are, an expectation-defying Christian. I want people to meet me and be surprised because they didn't think that's what a Christian was anymore. I'm here because, if I'm honest, I believe this is the most toxic, most diversity-resistant, most compassionless movement in my lifetime. And I believe silence in the face of it is participation in it. And my faith in Jesus teaches me that I'm not to be quiet. And so I'm here to be loud in the cause of love. And I'm here because life is heavy and it's difficult on its best days, right? Days when all the little stuff goes right. When you open up the refrigerator door and there's still milk there. Hallelujah. If you have a teenager, you understand. You know, days when you have a really good hair day or a really good lack of hair day, whatever the situation is. You just feel comfortable in your own skin. You hit all the green lights. Even when all that little stuff breaks right, life is heavy and it's difficult. And I believe that spiritual leaders should not pile burdens on already burdened people. And I want to leave this place lighter than when I arrived. So that's a little bit of why I do the work that I do. Now, it's great to be able to speak with you today. That's why your conversation is so important, because we have had a strange relationship up until this moment, friends, right? I write words and you read them. You may not even realize I can actually speak. And so the thing is that what happens is the written word is fraught with difficulty, right? And so now we can have a conversation. I remember I was at a festival. I gave a talk, and a gentleman came up to me afterward and said, "You know, John, I've been following your blog for a while." And I said, "Thank you." And he said, "Yeah, and after hearing you speak today, I don't think you're as much of a jerk as I thought you were from your writing." That was Stuart who introduced me, by the way. No, I'm kidding. Here's what I hope is going to happen today. We are not going to all agree theologically on everything. And we are not going to all agree on everything politically. At least that's what I hope. Because if we all agree on everything theologically and politically in this room, then the table of this room is still far too small, right? So if you hear something today that gives you anxiety, or as Italians say, agita, if you have some cause for stress or worry, embrace it, because it means you're being exposed to a diversity that is changing you, right? So I want to tell you a little bit about my story, and I want to begin by suggesting there's a familiar experience that many of us in this room have. So if you call your local cable provider and you want to establish service, invariably, there's going to be a conversation that's going to happen. The customer service representative is going to make you an offer. They're going to say, "Okay, you want cable, but you know, if you add phone and internet, we can package those services so that they'll be much less expensive than if you purchase them separately or from another vendor," right? This packaging of services is called what?
Bundling.
Bundling! Don't you love bundling? Because bundling makes you feel like you're getting something for nothing. Bundling makes you feel like you are cheating the system. Life is better when you bundle. And recently I turned 50 years old, and I'm more than a little bit ashamed to say that it took me far too many of those years to even begin to understand that as a white, cisgender, heterosexual man who was born in America, identifies as Christian, that I was born with the privilege bundle. Right? I was grandfathered into it. Actually, I was great-great-great-grandfathered into it. It was paid long before I arrived here. The more I began to walk through this world, I began to realize that the color of my skin and my gender and my orientation and my profession of faith and my very physicality, all these things, this bundle of privileges, has buffered me from many varieties of adversity. It's formed a barrier between me and struggles that many people experience on a daily basis. This bundle of privileges has opened doors for me that I didn't even realize were being opened. This bundle of privileges that I've been given, they've afforded me a multitude of advantages. Some I'm aware of, some I'm learning about, and some that I will never be able to see because of the skin with which I stand. And so this bundle of privileges, I have some and you have some. Everyone in this room has an arrangement of benefits in this life. And as we think about what the bigger table looks like, as we think about progressive theology in the world, think about the way that that bundle of privileges has shielded you from many things. Because I began to learn, friends, that I have been the beneficiary of inequity. That the world is set up in a way that I benefit simply by showing up the way I am. But that wasn't the story I would have told you growing up. See, if you would have met me, I would have told you that anyone can have access to an education. Even though I attended a school that most parents couldn't afford, and I never wanted for hot meals, or clothes, or rest, or a family, or good teachers, or anything that allowed me to thrive. So even though the story I told myself was anyone could get an education, the truth was I had it easy. And I could have told you growing up that anyone who worked hard could have succeeded. Although if my mom were here, she would say, John never worked very hard and somehow still succeeded. In fact, the story I would tell myself growing up was, if you got pulled over by the police, all you had to do was obey the rules and follow the laws and you'd be fine. Even though now looking back, I can distinctly remember my father being pulled over for excessive speeding in a school zone. And before the officer could even reach his window, my father rolled down the window and said, just give me the effing ticket. And the officer just gave him the effing ticket. And on we went. I always assumed that everyone had the same seat at the table that I had. And even though all the experiential evidence of my life testified loudly in opposition to the assumptions I had about the world, I needed that story to be true. I needed equity to be true. I needed the table to already exist big enough for everyone, because to hear evidence that it wasn't, I had to then realize I'm responsible to do something in the face of it. So I was not born a polarizing public figure talking about faith and politics. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, in a fairly traditional Italian Roman Catholic family, which means I was raised on gluten and guilt. Right? In here, there's a lot of pasta and a lot of repentance. And I still have a healthy appetite for both of those things. Now, growing up, I had two really great starting stories. The first story I started with was of a family who was for me. The people who raised me told me I could do anything and be anything, that they were in my corner, that I was original and beautiful. They said, John, it's America. You could grow up to be president because anyone can grow up to be president. Literally, anyone. Right? And so they told me that they were for me. And then, so I had this story of a family that was for me, but I also had a God story. And many of you might have started off with a God story. I had a God story, and my God story said that God was, and God was good, and this God was massive and made everything, and yet knew me intimately and loved me completely. And it was, and I believe still is, a true and beautiful story. So friends, I started off with the story of a family who was for me and a God who loved me, but yet I inherited some false stories too. I inherited false stories about gay people. I inherited false stories about people of color. I inherited false stories about Muslims. And in all the false stories that I inherited, something told me that I was just a little bit more deserving of the love of this great big God than they were. And the false stories that I inherited weren't the result of adults trying to mislead me. It's just that many of the adults who raised me were only around people who looked and talked and thought and believed and worshiped and loved the way that they did. And do you know that if you're only around people who look and talk and think and believe and worship and love the way that you do, your table's going to naturally be small. And you're going to naturally reside on stories about people, false stories, about people who don't look and talk and think and believe and worship and love the way that you do. So if I had stayed there in Syracuse, New York, in my little bubble, what was a snow globe? It was Syracuse, right? If I had stayed there, I would have grown up to be a decent human being. But I would have had a far too small table for the God I said I believed in. And I always tell people that God then gave me a gift. And the gift was the city of Philadelphia. Anyone here from Philadelphia? That's why you're the only people smiling right now. The rest of you are saying, wait a minute, Philadelphia? I've seen those Eagles fans. They're horrible. So if you've ever gone to a carnival, and you have a game where there's fish in little fish bowls, and you get a ping pong ball, and you try to throw that into the fish bowl, and if you get it in there, you get to take home a fish, right? And you take home the fish in a little Ziploc baggie, and if you have an aquarium, you can't just dump the fish right in, because the system shock will overwhelm the fish, you'll have a dead fish. Well, when I got to Philadelphia to study graphic design and illustration for college, and it was like I was dropped from 30,000 feet right into the city of brotherly love. Because I experienced two different things there in Philadelphia. One was, I was immersed now in diversity that I had never been immersed in. And I saw poverty that I never really understood existed. So I found diversity and poverty, but they were not in the form of intellectual exercises, not political debates, not theological arguments, but I experienced diversity and poverty in the form of names and faces and lives of people I was now living alongside. And those stories, they started to change me. Do you know that if you get better stories about people, it will change your heart toward them? That you may not like them more, but you'll actually understand them as fully formed human beings. You'll give them the dignity they deserve. And those stories really started to change me, so much so that I can remember my first Thanksgiving break as a freshman going home and having a conversation with my father. Now, have you ever had a really great experience and you tried to share that experience with someone who didn't have it? And you know how frustrating that is, right? Because they haven't seen what you've seen, they don't know what you know, and so you're trying to figure out how to do that. You do to those people what I was about to do to my father. Bulldoze them with your revelation. Because my dad was sitting there in the kitchen, the poor guy, he was a little bit more conservative than I was at the time, or so I thought. And we were having a conversation that I would have entitled, Poor People and Why They're Poor. And I said, all right, this is my moment. And I just ran in preaching. And I shared with him with great fervor and great velocity and great volume everything that I had seen, all the stories I'd heard, all the wisdom I'd acquired over the past 2 months, right? And I was really preaching and I was convincing because a voice that sounded like my own in the back of my head said, you're doing great. I said, I am. And I kept preaching. And my dad started to smile and shake his head. If you're trying to convince someone of something and they smile and shake their heads, you're not doing well. And he said, John, you've turned it into a real bleeding heart. And I was still preaching, so I just shot back. I'd rather have a bleeding heart than a dead one, Dad. And the fact that I'm alive here today, the fact that I'm still with you, means my father is far more compassionate than I gave him credit for. But the truth was that those stories started to change me. They took my theology and life, started to argue with my theology. And I always say that in Philadelphia, God rewrote my false stories, expanded my table, and prepared my heart for ministry. But ministry was like 10 years away because at that time I was an agnostic with suspicions. I was a hopeful agnostic. And I wanted nothing to do with spirituality, especially with organized religion. But something happened 10 years later. I met this girl, and her name is Jennifer, and we were deciding we wanted to get married, and we lived in a new area. And so we didn't have a church home. So we did something very spiritual. We looked in the yellow pages. Young people, Google that back there. So So we looked for churches. I start calling all these churches, and they said, well, you've got to be a member, or you've got to take this alone class, or you've got to get to the church for 6 months, or whatever it was. I was getting very discouraged. And then I called a Methodist church, and a female pastor answered, which I didn't realize such a thing existed. And her name was Susan May, and I still have the little post-it note with her name on it, and the time we were supposed to meet. And she said, well, why don't you come down on Sunday to our church, see what we're about. If you have a good experience, then let's talk. So we walked into this little chapel with less than 100 people in it, and everything changed because we saw all the things that we were missing from organized religion. And so we got married there, and 3 months later, I'm sitting on a Sunday, and I'm just going to scoot you over for a second here. It's a Sunday, and the church service is almost over, and I'm thinking very spiritual thoughts, like, I wonder where we're going to eat today. And I hope the Eagles' offensive line can handle the Giants' defensive pressure. Very spiritual things. And a woman taps me on the shoulder, and she smiles, and she says, John, I've been thinking about you and praying about you, and I think you would make the best youth leader. And I smiled and thought to myself, I know you. You're the current youth leader. She had paid her debt to society. She was getting out on good behavior. She needed a victim, she needed a minister of the Lord. And she said, would you want to come and hang out in our youth meeting tonight with our teenagers? And I thought, what could that change about the complete trajectory of my life, right? Do you ever have those pivot point moments in your life when you say yes to something and it changes everything? And see, the pivot point moments in our lives, they're always disguised as ordinary moments, so we're not aware at the time, because if we were, we would run screaming, we'd fall on our knees in prayer, or cry, because everything was about to change, and that's what happened for me. I went that night to this little church, I walked downstairs, moldy church basement, Civil War era furniture, moldy beanbags, leaky beanbags, because that's what you need in church youth groups. They have to have leaky beanbags or it's not sanctioned. And it was like a Bad News Bears assemblage of 5 or 6 kids. And everything changed because I realized some things about myself. One of the things I realized was I had a heart for teenagers. Middle and high school students, adolescents, that turbulent, noisy, messy time that most rational adults wanted to avoid, I wanted to be present for. I was like a demented storm chaser. Like, that looks horrible, let's go there. And I found that I loved working with teenagers, but I also found out that as I began to teach these young people a faith that I did not yet really have, my faith started to grow. I got surprised by God and worked really hard. My wife and I got involved in this program. It started to grow. They ended up offering me a part-time position there. And then finally they said, we want you to work full-time for us. And I remember being so confused and torn up because I knew what I was supposed to be doing. I was working in the field I had chosen. I had the plan going. You know the plan, right? And I remember thinking, okay, I really think this is the right thing to do, but I had a wife, right? So you know what it's like when your spouse, you have to break some news to them. So I'm like all torn up, my wife comes in, and I said, listen, sit down. And she said, who died? I said, not me yet, but it may happen. And I said, I'm thinking about actually jumping from my job and jumping into ministry full time, but it's really crazy, and I don't, it'd be reckless in some ways. And she said, I think you should do it. And I said, wow, that was easy. I had like a whole PowerPoint presentation prepared. And graphs and diagrams and all this. And so I started serving in the church full time as a minister. And then just a few years later, a mega church in Charlotte, North Carolina contacted me. They said, we want you to come down and serve in our church, serve our students. They had a ministry with several hundred students. So it was like moving on up to the big time, right? It's like the Jeffersons. And again, I had that conversation with my wife, and this was even worse because our son had just been born, our first child on either side. And we would be leaving all our families in the Northeast and going down south. So my wife walks in and I start pleading my case again, and about 30 seconds in she goes, I think we should go. And I said, would you stop being brave? I'm trying to be a coward here. You're not helping me. So we moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. And it's 2005. And if you had been in Charlotte, North Carolina in 2005, you hadn't met me. And I was super Christian mega pastor man. Like, I was up there on Sundays and I'm preaching to thousands of people. Our budget for our youth program is larger than most church budgets. We've got state-of-the-art facilities. We've got several hundred students. I'm writing music for the church that we're recording and singing in church. And we're doing radical work in the city. I have freedom to do anything I want. And the students are coming in droves and we're doing beautiful work. And I loved it and I embraced it. And it really worked for me until it no longer worked for me. Did you ever have something that used to work for you no longer work for you? You get older, that happens. I understand. Right? You get married, that happens. If I was super Christian mega pastor man, I experienced 2 pieces of kryptonite. And I know you're here because you have experienced them too. The first piece of kryptonite I experienced was I started to have theological questions. Like questions about our treatment of the LGBTQ community. Questions about a loving God who would send me to hell for eternity. Questions about why there were so few female pastors. Now you're good people, so you've never had those questions. But I did, right? And you understand the existential crisis of having the faith that used to be bedrock suddenly start to shift. And it's one thing to be a civilian Christian, to be in the pews or in the chairs, and experience that doubt, experience that crisis of faith. But it's another to be standing in the position that I was in, super Christian mega pastor man, being expected to say with specificity and authority and clarity, this is who God is, this is what God says, and this is how you are to operate based on what that God says. And the problem was, friends, that my theological questions were causing a tension in me. Because there was the person that I felt called to be as I studied the teachings of Jesus. And there was the pastor I was expected to be. There were things I knew I couldn't say any longer. And that started to be a burden inside. But I started to preach around them. Because that's what pastors do. You know, if you have a pastor right now who is not as progressive as you would like them to be, they are doing what I did. They are terrified of the progression of their faith. They're terrified of the doubts and questions because they know if I speak this message, I know who's going to get angry, where they sit, and how much they give. And what happens is most ministers become beholden to the people they serve. And so they never share the full contents of their doubts. And so I wasn't going to. So I could talk around that doubt. But you know what? I had another problem. The other piece of kryptonite I had was 10 years after my time in Philadelphia, 10 years into ministry, I had a really small table again. Did you know that the church can shrink your table? Because now I was only around Christians. I was only around Christians from my church, only Christians from my church who believe what I believe, and I was only around Christians from my church who believe what I believed, who I liked, which was a small list. Basically my wife, that was it. But I was no longer around diversity because to be with diversity, to be around gay people and Muslims and atheists, well, that was bad for a pastor unless I was going to save or fix or change or renovate them. So I started to lean into stories of marginalized people. I started to talk with LGBTQ people again. I started to spend time with Muslim families. I started to talk to people who were being alienated by the church. See, what they were telling me was, John, you know this thing you're a part of? It doesn't seem like it just wants to exclude me. It actually seems like it's out to harm me. So I had a problem. I had these doubts. I had these stories of marginalized people, and yet I had a job as super Christian mega pastor man. So I had 2 choices. I could either avoid the questions, hide the doubts, and ignore the stories of marginalized people, or I could lean into them. I could write about them on my blog, I could tell them in my sermons, and I could ask people I served, why is the church so toxic to so many? So I decided to lean into both of those things. And I started working at a new church in Raleigh, North Carolina, and only 5 months into my time there, I heard God calling me to leave that church. Came in the form of my pastor's voice saying, "You're fired." I'd like to say it was in my quiet time. You know, it was a voice, and it sounded like Morgan Freeman. And the voice said, "John, no." But no, it was a Thursday afternoon at a Starbucks with strangers hearing my life fall apart. And it was devastating to me, not because I lost a job, but because I was a pastor. That wasn't my job title, it was what I did. I wanted to live alongside people, and I wanted to care for them. And so this was devastating to me for that reason, but I also began to question God. Because see, even though I said, you know, God, people in the Bible, yeah, they suffered, but I thought we had a deal here. I serve you, and you make everything nice. And so I was devastated for like 2 or 3 hours. Like, if you had seen me that afternoon, you would have said, like, watch him, okay? And I can remember having this sort of tearful conversation with myself. I'm crying, and I'm eating emotionally, and I'm watching Turner Classic Movies, because that's what I do. And then I'm torn up, and I say, for the first time in 17 years, I don't have a local community to be a part of. I don't have a church to go to. I don't have a group of people to pastor. And I'm torn up, and then another voice that sounds like my own, but happier, says, "John, guess what? You know what the good news is? For the first time in 17 years, you don't have a local church to go to. You can stay home on Sunday. You can watch football all day." But really, what that voice said was, "John, for the first time in 17 years, you don't have to represent anyone else's faith convictions but your own." And I realize I've been given a gift that so few ministers have and many Christians don't have. I can now ask anything and I can say everything. And when you can ask anything and say everything in your relationships or your identity or your career, you never want to give that up, right? And so I started doing this work. I started asking myself, did I still want to be a pastor? Did I still want to be a Christian? Did I still want to serve in a church? And if I did, what was I going to do differently now, knowing what I knew? And so I went back to my tradition. I went back to the thing I fell in love with about Jesus. I went back to Jesus' table ministry, I call it. You may not know this, but many of you do, that all throughout the gospel stories, Jesus used the act of breaking bread with people, the act of sharing a meal with them, as a way to let them know that they were seen and heard and loved and respected. And what was startling was Jesus' diverse guest list at the table. Jesus dines with priests and with prostitutes. He dines with a religious elite and the street rabble. Jesus dines with his disciples, and he dines with his adversaries. And I don't know about you, but I'm in no hurry to dine with my adversaries. I will have coffee with my adversaries, right? But Jesus' table ministry is detailed through all 4 gospel biographers, but they all share this one story that I love. And I'll paraphrase it in 90 seconds. Jesus is on a hillside preaching, and like most preachers, he's gone long. And his students say, "Jesus, it's getting late. You started preaching on Saturday. It's now Sunday. Chick-fil-A is closed. These people are hungry. Where are they going to eat?" And the story goes that Jesus says, "Well, feed them." And the story goes that they start to panic, and Jesus says, "Well, what do you have?" So they collect whatever they have, some bread and some fish, right? And the story goes that Jesus blesses it. He gives thanks for it. And then they feed thousands there. Now, I used to read this story as a how story, and it used to always mess me up. I would get tripped up by the mechanism of the miracle, right? Because I'd say, okay, I've got a 9-year-old, a 14-year-old, 1 box of Kraft macaroni and cheese. I cannot make that work. How did they feed all those people? But now in this new place of freedom, I read that story as a who and a what and a why story. The who was Jesus. The what was Jesus feeds people. And the why is because they were hungry. What became revelatory in that story was not what Jesus did, but what he didn't do. There was no spiritual gifts assessment test. There is no altar call. There is no offering taken. There's no screening of theological beliefs or political affiliation or dating history. No one has to do anything to prove that they're worthy to be fed there, right? Their hunger and Jesus' compassion for them makes them worthy to be fed. And that's what I wanted to do. If I was going to still call myself a Christian, I just wanted to feed hungry people, whatever that looked like. So I went back to Jesus' table ministry, but I went back to another table. I went back to my family table, because I told you I was raised Italian. And growing up, we always had a house, but we really didn't need the house. The house was just an expensive library covering for the kitchen. Right? The kitchen table was the place we spent so much time. And around that table we talked and we gossiped and we argued and we laughed and we entertained and we ate. And I had my spot at the table, right? And I remember thinking, those are the sweetest parts of my family that I look back on. It's not family vacations or big trips or big events. It's sitting there and experiencing belonging. That simple exhale when you're just with people who allow you to be authentic. So, feeding people because they're hungry, the table ministry of Jesus, and my family table of belonging, that's what I wanted to do. And so even though I had no job and no idea what I was doing, I decided to keep moving in that, lean toward that. And one day I wrote a blog post called If I Have Gay Children, because I realized that conservative Christians were dehumanizing people. They were having a conversation about a theology and not about human beings. And that they were talking about people and not to them. And so I wanted to humanize that whole issue. And so I wrote these words, it was like 800 words, and I posted them, and they, within a day, 500,000 people had read them, and then several million more the next day. The next day I'm on CNN, and then it's as if God said, oh, you want a bigger table? Well, here you go. And that's the work I've been doing. I wrote a book called The Bigger Table about all this, and part of it was the idea that we could create redemptive spiritual community among disparate people, that we could find common ground over the table of Jesus, that we could have communities that were noted by their hospitality, that meant that you were celebrated, not just merely tolerated, right? Because you know there's a difference when you're in a place where you're celebrated and when you're in a place where you're merely tolerated, and you know when you're in a place where you're not wanted, and no one needs to use words to tell you any of that. But I wanted communities that were known by that radical hospitality and total authenticity, where you could be who you were, you could believe what you believed or didn't believe, and there were no deal breakers in you. True diversity, not just sanitized diversity, not just some people, not just people we're comfortable with, not just people who weren't too messy or too progressive or too angry or too loud or too whatever. And communities that had a gender-free relationship where you met with people not to fix or change or save or renovate them, just to sit with their stories. So that's what I wrote A Bigger Table about. That's what I began traveling the country about. Here's the problem. I wrote that book in 2015. Yeah. Because see, then we had some things. We had a presidential campaign. We had an election season. We've had a presidency. The problem I have now is I'm not sure how big I want the table some days. Because there are people that I am not wanting to welcome. I can tell myself a story about why that is, and some of that story is true. I can tell myself that I'm trying to protect marginalized people, and that's partly true. But I want you to know that I can see in me, and probably you can see in you, your inconsistency or your hypocrisy or even your fraudulence when you resist welcome that you have insisted people give. And here's the problem, friends. People at the bigger table, which we're trying to be, it's almost impossible to show compassion for people who have no compassion. I've spent a decade telling a group of Christians, hey, you over there, Jesus says you're supposed to love people who don't agree with you. You're supposed to be kind to people who don't share your life experiences. I was really good at it, and now those people are saying, well, now you show it to me. And I'm saying, that wasn't for me. That lesson was for you, from the Lord. I want to name that, right? I want to name the tension of the bigger table. because it's there. It's why Jesus was always in the mess. It's why Jesus was killed. And I know what we're going to do is we're going to take a break shortly, and we're going to have another time to talk. But I did want to just give us a couple seconds to have you ask some questions, because I don't want you to lose what you're thinking right now. So really informally, what are you thinking as I'm sharing some of this? Questions you're having, frustrations, encouragements. What's on your mind? What's God stirred up in you? Or what are you coming to hear?
Why does so many people accept lies that are just basic lies that you don't have to go look for the answer to the truth now?
Why do people accept lies? Okay, same reason that I say to my wife, have I put on weight? Now, I don't want the truth. I want her to tell me that I look exactly the way I looked in high school. We all have a story that we tell ourselves, and we will buffer ourselves with whatever reinforces that story. And even though we're talking often as progressive Christians about a group of people who we see as very small-minded or very fearful, and they probably are in a lot of ways, because they're living in a world that their God is actually small, it actually resembles them, and they're terrified. So they will do anything to have their story be true. Because like me, I didn't want to hear about the reality of my privilege, for example, because I knew to hear that, I would have to look at everything in the world differently, and I would have to change my behavior. Most people don't want to change their behavior, and they don't actually want to know what the Bible says. A group of Christians will say, well, the Bible says this. They don't know what the Bible says. Usually they know there's 5 or 6 verses that their pastors keep handing them, and they don't want to go any more detailed than that. And part of it is just human nature. Part of it is the fact that we have become intellectually lazy, right? I wrote a blog post recently, and someone said, I love this so much. It's a little long though, John. It was 700 words. A couple tweets long. That was too long. And so there are a group of people now is they would rather give me the short, quick version of my Christianity so I don't have to do any work and I can just keep going. So if you get someone like Franklin Graham and he says, here's your religion in these verses, people will say, thank you, and then they move on. The challenge is, how do you get people to dig deeper? Because most people don't have time for an existential crisis. Most people don't have time to actually investigate why they believe what they believe. That's why you'll see a progressive gathering, which is wonderful. We've filled this building, but Franklin Graham will have thousands upon thousands upon thousands, and he'll say, be afraid. And people say, okay. That's the challenge we're up against. We'll talk more about that in the second session. I saw him.
I want to hear more about the attitude you have where I don't really want a bigger table because I don't like some of those people. I see signs in front of churches that say everyone welcome, and I always think, really? Are you sure?
So you would like me to explain more about my hesitancy to welcome other people, or the tension that I felt in recent weeks or months? I'm sorry, that's all the time we have today. This goes 2 ways. One of the hearts of a bigger table is true diversity. And so I have people of a certain political persuasion or a certain theological persuasion, and they say, hey, John, you're always talking about the bigger table, but here's what I believe, here's how I voted. Am I still welcome at your table? So I'll have to think about how I answer that, because what I find is they're usually using my diversity or my tolerance against me. Because what I want to make clear as we do this work of expanding the table, I'll say to people, if you can come and sit alongside someone without an agenda to fix or change or save or renovate them, if you can come and sit across from someone who's LGBTQ and not see them as less human or less morally worthy than you are, then you can sit at the bigger table. But I'm not going to allow active violence and bigotry at the bigger table. So the table is bigger, not because you can do or say anything you want when you get there. The table is bigger because everyone's inherent worth is respected there. So the last thing I want to do is I'm trying to push for diversity. I don't want to sacrifice vulnerable people on the altar of my ceremonial diversity. So if I'm going to bring together a transgender teenager and white Southern Baptist sign guy, it's a much greater ask of the teenager. She has more to lose, and she has a harder path to get there. So part of it is I'm going to keep loving people who I see are terrified and have a faith that makes them do horrible things, but I'm never going to allow them proximity to do harm to other people. So you're welcome, your humanity is honored here, but your opinions are not all welcome here. And, you know, I was talking to a teenager who identifies as transgender. We're in the coffee shop of a hotel, and we're talking about these issues. And she said, John, how do you, it sounds great, but how do you love him? And she points outside the window. Right outside the window of the coffee shop is Southern Baptist sign guy. He's got a bullhorn and a sign that says she's going to hell for who she is and how she loves. Bunch of scriptures that claim to back that up. She said, how do I love him? And I wanted to phone a friend. And I said, here, we have to, the best we can do with Southern Baptist sign guy is two things. We realized that he was not born Southern Baptist sign guy. That just like you and me, he had a family of origin. He had people who spoke into his life. He had a church that he was part of. He has an image of God in his head. He has a road that led him to this moment, standing there with that sign. And the second thing we do is we realize that right now, he's doing exactly what you and I are doing. He's trying to hear what he believes the voice of God is saying and respond to the voice of God because he wants to do what God wants him to do. The people you're thinking about right now who are problematic and they're Christian, they don't realize they're being horrible. No one ever does. You never do. We never realize when we're being mean-spirited. We never realize when we're being bigoted. We all think we're getting it right. Because when I was having a Q&A recently, a woman stood up and she was on fire. And she said, John, you know what? Keep going, keep being loud, because here's the deal. We have right on our side. We have to speak up for what's right, because what's wrong is wrong, and we have to stop this now. I said, that sounds great, but do you know across town, there's a bizarro gathering of people the opposite of you and the opposite of me in theology, and they're saying exactly the same thing. So part of that is the tension. We stand for what we stand for. We don't compromise our principles. We don't soften our language, the explicit nature in which we speak. But we realize there's a person behind the horrible theology, the terrible behavior, the anger. One more and we'll take a quick break. Yes?
I think this is a good dovetail with your last answer. What's your viewpoint of the primary driving forces behind the evangelical community's embrace of the present administration?
Okay, two things.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, I will. The two things. The question is, how do you explain evangelicals' embracing of the current president? It's white evangelicals, right? Because most people of color are going, hello. But 80+% of white evangelicals have embraced this political movement for two reasons, I think. One is because conservative theology wants a leader, a strong leader to tell them what to do. Progressive Christians don't want that. There are not progressive Billy Grahams, there are not progressive Jerry Falwell for a reason. We believe in free thinking as progressives. We believe in respecting story. We believe in sitting with difference. We believe in tolerance toward disagreement. And so we tend to be genuinely nicer about our faith. What that means is, believe what you believe, and I'll believe what I believe. And we don't want anyone to say, here is your progressive faith, because we go, wait a minute, no, we're out. So as a result, what the president does is step in and say, I'm going to give you the strong leader that you want. I'm going to tell you short sound bites so you don't even have to research it. I'm going to tell you my version of the truth. And then those terrified Christians say, oh, thank you. And the other thing is, right now there is a movement in our country that specifically only traffics in fear, that says you're in danger. There are people coming to take your jobs. They're coming over the border. You're in trouble. You need a gun. You need protection. I'll give it to you. we're all terrified, but we realize that the answer is not going to be in force or might or power, but there are some people who've been led to believe that's what truth is. And then the third part about it, is just simply power grab. People saying, this is the way the wind is blowing, so we're going to go with it. If you had asked people in 2015, evangelical leaders, what do you think of a man like this? They would have said it's the antithesis of Jesus. But they found a way to embrace.